This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 29. Surely whoever speaks to me in the right voice, him or her I shall follow, as the water follows the moon, silently, with fluid steps, anywhere around the globe. Walt Whitman. "Now my cousins are at Diplow," said Grandcourt. "Will you go there? To-morrow? The carriage shall come for Mrs. Davilow. You can tell me what you would like done in the rooms. Things must be put in decent order while we are away at Ryelands, and to-morrow is the only day." He was sitting sideways on a sofa in the drawing-room at Offendene, one hand and elbow resting on the back, and the other hand thrust between his crossed knees, in the attitude of a man who is much interested in watching the person next to him. Gwendolen, who had always disliked needlework, had taken to it with apparent zeal since her engagement, and now held a piece of white embroidery which on examination would have shown many false stitches. During the last 8 or 9 days their hours had been chiefly spent on horseback, but some margin had always been left for this more difficult sort of companionship, which, however, Gwendolen had not found disagreeable. She was very well satisfied with Grandcourt. His answers to her lively questions about what he had seen and done in his life bore drawling very well. From the first she had noticed that he knew what to say, and she was constantly feeling not only that he had nothing of the fool in his composition, but that by some subtle means he communicated to her the impression that all the folly lay with other people who did what he did not care to do. A man who seems to have been able to command the best has a sovereign power of depreciation. Then Grandcourt's behavior as a lover had hardly at all passed the limit of an amorous homage which was inobtrusive as a wafted odor of roses, and spent all its effects in a gratified vanity. One day indeed he had kissed not her cheek but her neck a little below her ear, and Gwendolen, taken by surprise, had started up with a marked agitation which made him rise too and say, "I beg your pardon. Did I annoy you?" "Oh, it was nothing," said Gwendolen, rather afraid of herself. "Only I cannot bear to be kissed under my ear." She sat down with a little playful laugh, but all the while she felt her heart beating with a vague fear. She was no longer at liberty to flout him as she had flouted poor Rex. Her agitation seemed not uncomplimentary, and he had been contented not to transgress again. To-day a slight rain hindered riding, but to compensate, a package had come from London, and Mrs. Davilow had just left the room after bringing in for admiration the beautiful things, of Grandcourt's ordering, which lay scattered about on the tables. Gwendolen was just then enjoying the scenery of her life. She let her hands fall in her lap, and said with a pretty air of perversity, "Why is to-morrow the only day?" "Because the next day is the first with the hounds," said Grandcourt. "And after that?" "After that I must go away for a couple of days. It's a bore, but I shall go one day and come back the next." Grandcourt noticed a change in her face, and releasing his hand from under his knees he laid it on hers, and said, "You object to my going away?" "It's no use objecting," said Gwendolen coldly. She was resisting to the utmost her temptation to tell him that she suspected to whom he was going, the temptation to make a clean breast, speaking without restraint. "Yes, it is," said Grandcourt, enfolding her hand. "I will put off going, and I will travel at night so as only to be away one day." He thought that he knew the reason of what he inwardly called this bit of temper, and she was particularly fascinating to him at this moment. "Then don't put off going, but travel at night," said Gwendolen, feeling that she could command him, and finding in his peremptoriness a small outlet for her irritation. "Then you will go to Diplow to-morrow?" "Oh yes, if you wish it," said Gwendolen, in a high tone of careless assent. Her concentration in other feelings had really hindered her from taking notice that her hand was being held. "How you treat us poor devils of men," said Grandcourt, lowering his tone. "We are always getting the worst of it." "Are you?" said Gwendolen, in a tone of inquiry, looking at him more naively than usual. She longed to believe this commonplace badinage as the serious truth about her lover. In that case she too was justified. If she knew everything, Mrs. Glasher would appear more blamable than Grandcourt. "Are you always getting the worst?" "Yes. Are you as kind to me as I am to you?" said Grandcourt, looking into her eyes with his narrow gaze. Gwendolen felt herself stricken. She was conscious of having received so much that her sense of command was checked, and sank away in the perception that, look around her as she might, she could not turn back. It was as if she had consented to mount a chariot where another held the reins, and it was not in her nature to leap out in the eyes of the world. She had not consented in ignorance, and all she could say now would be a confession that she had not been ignorant. Her right to explanation was gone. All she had to do now was to adjust herself, so that the spikes of that unwilling penance which conscience imposed should not gall her. With a sort of mental shiver she resolutely changed her mental attitude. There had been a little pause, during which she had not turned away her eyes, and with a sudden break into a smile she said, "If I were as kind to you as you are to me, that would spoil your generosity. It would no longer be as great as it could be. And it is that now." "Then I am not to ask for one kiss?" said Grandcourt, contented to pay a large price for this new kind of love-making, which introduced marriage by the finest contrast. "Not one?" said Gwendolen, getting saucy, and nodding at him defiantly. He lifted her little left hand to his lips, and then released it respectfully. Clearly it was faint praise to say of him that he was not disgusting. He was almost charming, and she felt at this moment that it was not likely she could ever have loved another man better than this one. His reticence gave her some inexplicable, delightful consciousness. "Apropos," she said, taking up her work again, "is there any one besides Captain and Mrs. Torrington at Diplow? Or do you leave them tête-à-tête? I suppose he converses in cigars, and she answers with her chignon." "She has a sister with her," said Grandcourt, with his shadow of a smile, "and there are 2 men besides. One of them you know, I believe." "Ah, then I have a poor opinion of him," said Gwendolen, shaking her head. "You saw him at Leubronn. Young Deronda, a young fellow with the Mallingers." Gwendolen felt as if her heart were making a sudden gambol, and her fingers, which tried to keep a firm hold on her work, got cold. "I never spoke to him," she said, dreading any discernible change in herself. "Is he not disagreeable?" "No, not particularly," said Grandcourt, in his most languid way. "He thinks a little too much of himself. I thought he had been introduced to you." "Some one told me his name the evening before I came away. That was all. What is he?" "A sort of ward of Sir Hugo Mallinger's. Nothing of any consequence." "Oh, poor creature! How very unpleasant for him," said Gwendolen, speaking from the lip and not meaning any sarcasm. "I wonder if it has left off raining," she added, rising and going to look out of the window. Happily it did not rain the next day, and Gwendolen rode to Diplow on Criterion as she had done on that former day when she returned with her mother in the carriage. She always felt the more daring for being in her riding dress, besides having the agreeable belief that she looked as well as possible in it, a sustaining consciousness in any meeting which seems formidable. Her anger toward Deronda had changed into a superstitious dread, due perhaps to the coercion he had exercised over her thought, lest the first interference of his in her life might foreshadow some future influence. It is of such stuff that superstitions are commonly made, an intense feeling about ourselves which makes the evening star shine at us with a threat, and the blessing of a beggar encourage us. And superstitions carry consequences, which often verify their hope or their foreboding. The time before luncheon was taken up for Gwendolen by going over the rooms with Mrs. Torrington and Mrs. Davilow, and she thought it likely that if she saw Deronda, there would hardly be need for more than a bow between them. She meant to notice him as little as possible. And after all she found herself under an inward compulsion too strong for her pride. From the first moment of their being in the room together, she seemed to herself to be doing nothing but notice him. Everything else was automatic performance of an habitual part. When he took his place at lunch, Grandcourt had said, "Deronda, Miss Harleth tells me you were not introduced to her at Leubronn." "Miss Harleth hardly remembers me, I imagine," said Deronda, looking at her quite simply as they bowed. "She was intensely occupied when I saw her." Now, did he suppose that she had not suspected him of being the person who redeemed her necklace? "On the contrary, I remember you very well," said Gwendolen, feeling rather nervous, but governing herself, and looking at him in return with new examination. "You did not approve of my playing at roulette." "How did you come to that conclusion?" said Deronda, gravely. "Oh, you cast an evil eye on my play," said Gwendolen, with a turn of her head and a smile. "I began to lose as soon as you came to look on. I had always been winning till then." "Roulette in such a kennel as Leubronn is a horrid bore," said Grandcourt. "I found it a bore when I began to lose," said Gwendolen. Her face was turned toward Grandcourt as she smiled and spoke, but she gave a sidelong glance at Deronda, and saw his eyes fixed on her with a look so gravely penetrating that it had a keener edge for her than his ironical smile at her losses—a keener edge than Klesmer's judgment. She wheeled her neck round as if she wanted to listen to what was being said by the rest, while she was only thinking of Deronda. His face had that disturbing kind of form and expression which threatens to affect opinion, as if one's standard was somehow wrong. Who has not seen men with faces of this corrective power till they frustrated it by speech or action? His voice, heard now for the first time, was to Grandcourt's toneless drawl, which had been in her ears every day, as the deep notes of a violoncello to the broken discourse of poultry and other lazy gentry in the afternoon sunshine. Grandcourt, she inwardly conjectured, was perhaps right in saying that Deronda thought too much of himself—a favorite way of explaining a superiority that humiliates. However, the talk turned on the rinderpest and Jamaica, and no more was said about roulette. Grandcourt held that the Jamaica negro was a beastly sort of Baptist Caliban. Deronda said he had always felt a little with Caliban, who naturally had his own point of view and could sing a good song. Mrs. Davilow observed that her father had an estate in Barbados, but that she herself had never been in the West Indies. Mrs. Torrington was sure she should never sleep in her bed if she lived among blacks. Her husband corrected her by saying that the blacks would be manageable enough if it were not for the half-breeds; and Deronda remarked that the whites had to thank themselves for the half-breeds. While this polite pea-shooting was going on, Gwendolen trifled with her jelly, and looked at every speaker in turn that she might feel at ease in looking at Deronda. "I wonder what he thinks of me, really. He must have felt interested in me, else he would not have sent me the necklace. I wonder what he thinks of my marriage. What notions has he to make him so grave about things? Why is he come to Diplow?" These questions ran in her mind as the voice of an uneasy longing to be judged by Deronda with unmixed admiration, a longing which had had its seed in her first resentment at his critical glance. Why did she care so much about the opinion of this man who was nothing of any consequence? She had no time to find the reason: she was too much engaged in caring. In the drawing-room, when something had called Grandcourt away, she went quite unpremeditatedly up to Deronda, who was standing at a table apart turning over some prints, and said to him, "Shall you hunt to-morrow, Mr. Deronda?" "Yes, I believe so." "You don't object to hunting, then?" "I find excuses for it. It is a sin I am inclined to, when I can't get boating or cricketing." "Do you object to my hunting?" said Gwendolen, with a saucy movement of the chin. "I have no right to object to anything you choose to do." "You thought you had a right to object to my gambling," persisted Gwendolen. "I was sorry for it. I am not aware that I told you of my objection," said Deronda, with his usual directness of gaze, a large-eyed gravity innocent of any intention. His eyes had a peculiarity which has drawn many men into trouble. They were of a dark yet mild intensity which seemed to express a special interest in every one on whom he fixed them, and might easily help to bring on him those claims which ardently sympathetic people are often creating in the minds of those who need help. In mendicant fashion we make the goodness of others a reason for exorbitant demands on them. That sort of effect was penetrating Gwendolen. "You hindered me from gambling again," she answered. But she had no sooner spoken than she blushed over face and neck, and Deronda blushed too, conscious that in the little affair of the necklace he had taken a questionable freedom. It was impossible to speak further, and she turned away to a window, feeling that she had stupidly said what she had not meant to say, and yet being rather happy that she had plunged into this mutual understanding. Deronda also did not like it. Gwendolen seemed more decidedly attractive than before, and certainly there had been changes going on within her since that time at Leubronn. The struggle of mind attending a conscious error had wakened something like a new soul, which had better but also worse possibilities than her former poise of crude self-confidence. Among the forces she had come to dread was something within her that troubled satisfaction. That evening Mrs. Davilow said, "Was it really so, or only a joke of yours, about Mr. Deronda spoiling your play, Gwen?" Her curiosity had been excited, and she could venture to ask a question that did not concern Mr. Grandcourt. "Oh, it merely happened that he was looking on when I began to lose," said Gwendolen carelessly. "I noticed him." "I don't wonder at that. He is a striking young man. He puts me in mind of Italian paintings. One would guess without being told that there was foreign blood in his veins." "Is there?" said Gwendolen. "Mrs. Torrington says so. I asked particularly who he was, and she told me that his mother was some foreigner of high rank." "His mother!" said Gwendolen, rather sharply. "Then who was his father?" "Well, every one says he is the son of Sir Hugo Mallinger, who brought him up, though he passes for a ward. She says, if Sir Hugo Mallinger could have done as he liked with his estates, he would have left them to this Mr. Deronda, since he has no legitimate son." Gwendolen was silent, but her mother observed so marked an effect on her face that she was angry with herself for having repeated Mrs. Torrington's gossip. It seemed on reflection unsuited to the ear of her daughter, for whom Mrs. Davilow disliked what is called knowledge of the world, and indeed she wished that she herself had not had any of it thrust upon her. An image which had immediately arisen in Gwendolen's mind was that of the unknown mother, no doubt a dark-eyed woman, probably sad. Hardly any face could be less like Deronda's than that represented as Sir Hugo's in a crayon portrait at Diplow. A dark-eyed woman no longer young had become stuff of the conscience to Gwendolen. That night when she had got into her little bed and only a dim light was burning, she said, "Mamma, have men generally children before they are married?" "No, dear, no," said Mrs. Davilow. "Why do you ask such a question?" But she began to think that she saw the why. "If it were so, I ought to know," said Gwendolen with some indignation. "You were thinking of what I said about Mr. Deronda and Sir Hugo Mallinger. That is a very unusual case, dear." "Does Lady Mallinger know?" "She knows enough to satisfy her. That is quite clear, because Mr. Deronda has lived with them." "And people think no worse of him?" "Well, of course he is under some disadvantage. It is not as if he were Lady Mallinger's son. He does not inherit the property, and he is not of any consequence in the world, but people are not obliged to know anything about his birth. You see, he is very well received." "I wonder whether he knows about it, and whether he is angry with his father?" "My dear child, why should you think of that?" "Why?" said Gwendolen impetuously, sitting up in her bed. "Haven't children reason to be angry with their parents? How can they help their parents marrying or not marrying?" But a consciousness rushed upon her which made her fall back again on her pillow. It was not only what she would have felt months before, that she might seem to be reproaching her mother for that second marriage of hers. What she chiefly felt now was, that she had been led on to a condemnation which seemed to make her own marriage a forbidden thing. There was no further talk, and till sleep came over her, Gwendolen lay struggling with the reasons against that marriage—reasons which pressed upon her newly now that they were unexpectedly mirrored in the story of a man whose slight relations with her had, by some hidden affinity, bitten themselves into the most permanent layers of feeling. It was characteristic that with all her debating she was never troubled by the question whether the indefensibleness of her marriage did not include the fact that she had accepted Grandcourt solely as a man whom it was convenient for her to marry, not in the least as one to whom she would be binding herself in duty. Gwendolen's ideas were pitiably crude, but many grand difficulties of life are apt to force themselves on us in our crudity. And to judge wisely, I suppose we must know how things appear to the unwise, that kind of appearance making the larger part of the world's history. In the morning there was a double excitement for her. She was going to hunt, from which scruples about propriety had threatened to hinder her until it was found that Mrs. Torrington was horsewoman enough to accompany her, going to hunt for the first time since her escapade with Rex, and she was going again to see Deronda, in whom, since last night, her interest had so gathered that she expected, as people do about revealed celebrities, to see something in his appearance which she had missed before. What was he going to be? What sort of life had he before him, he being nothing of any consequence? And with only a little difference in events he might have been as important as Grandcourt. Nay, her imagination inevitably went into that direction, might have held the very estates which Grandcourt was to have. But now Deronda would probably some day see her mistress of the Abbey at Topping, see her bearing the title which would have been his own wife's. These obvious futile thoughts of what might have been made a new epoch for Gwendolen. She whose unquestionable habit it had been to take the best that came to her for less than her own claim, had now to see the position which tempted her in a new light, as a hard, unfair exclusion of others. What she had now heard about Deronda seemed to her imagination to throw him into one group with Mrs. Glasher and her children, before whom she felt herself in an attitude of apology, she who had hitherto been surrounded by a group that in her opinion had need be apologetic to her. Perhaps Deronda himself was thinking of these things. Could he know of Mrs. Glasher? If he knew that she knew, he would despise her, but he could have no such knowledge. Would he, without that, despise her for marrying Grandcourt? His possible judgment of her actions was telling on her as importunately as Klesmer's judgment of her powers. But she found larger room for resistance to a disapproval of her marriage, because it is easier to make our conduct seem justifiable to ourselves than to make our ability strike others. "How can I help it?" is not our favorite apology for incompetency, but Gwendolen felt some strength in saying, "How can I help what other people have done? Things would not come right if I were to turn round now and declare that I would not marry Mr. Grandcourt." And such turning round was out of the question. The horses in the chariot she had mounted were going at full speed. This mood of youthful, elated desperation had a tidal recurrence. She could dare anything that lay before her sooner than she could choose to go backward into humiliation, and it was even soothing to think that there would now be as much ill-doing in the one as in the other. But the immediate delightful fact was the hunt, where she would see Deronda and where he would see her, for always lurking ready to obtrude before other thoughts about him was the impression that he was very much interested in her. But to-day she was resolved not to repeat her folly of yesterday, as if she were anxious to say anything to him. Indeed, the hunt would be too absorbing. And so it was for a long while. Deronda was there and within her sight very often, but this only added to the stimulus of a pleasure which Gwendolen had only once before tasted, and which seemed likely always to give a delight independent of any crosses, except such as took away the chance of riding. No accident happened to throw them together. The run took them within convenient reach of home, and the agreeable somberness of the gray November afternoon with a long stratum of yellow light in the west, Gwendolen was returning with the company from Diplow, who were attending her on the way to Offendene. Now the sense of glorious excitement was over and gone. She was getting irritably disappointed that she had had no opportunity of speaking to Deronda, whom she would not see again, since he was to go away in a couple of days. What was she going to say? That was not quite certain. She wanted to speak to him. Grandcourt was by her side, Mrs. Torrington, her husband, and another gentleman in advance, and Deronda's horse she could hear behind. The wish to speak to him and have him speaking to her was becoming imperious, and there was no chance of it unless she simply asserted her will and defied everything. Where the order of things would give way to Miss Gwendolen, it must be made to do so. They had lately emerged from a wood of pines and beeches, where the twilight stillness had a repressing effect, which increased her impatience. The horse hoofs again heard behind at some little distance were a growing irritation. She reined in her horse and looked behind her. Grandcourt, after a few paces, also paused, But she, waving her whip and nodding sideways with playful imperiousness, said, "Go on. I want to speak to Mr. Deronda." Grandcourt hesitated, but that he would have done after any proposition. It was an awkward situation for him. No gentleman before marriage could give the emphasis of refusal to a command delivered in this playful way. He rode on slowly, and she waited till Deronda came up. He looked at her with tacit inquiry, and she said at once, letting her horse go alongside of his, "Mr. Deronda, you must enlighten my ignorance. I want to know why you thought it wrong for me to gamble. Is it because I am a woman?" "Not altogether, but I regretted it the more because you were a woman," said Deronda, with an irrepressible smile. Apparently it must be understood between them now that it was he who sent the necklace. "I think it would be better for men not to gamble. It's a besotting kind of taste, likely to turn into a disease. And besides, there is something revolting to me in raking a heap of money together, and internally chuckling over it when others are feeling the loss of it. I should even call it base, if it were more than an exceptional lapse. There are enough inevitable turns of fortune which force us to see that our gain is another's loss. That is one of the ugly aspects of life. One would like to reduce it as much as one could, not get amusement out of exaggerating it." Deronda's voice had gathered some indignation while he was speaking. "But you do admit that we can't help things," said Gwendolen, with a drop in her tone. The answer had not been anything like what she had expected. "I mean that things are so in spite of us. We can't always help it that our gain is another's loss." "Clearly. Because of that, we should help it where we can." Gwendolen, biting her lip inside, paused a moment, and then, forcing herself to speak with an air of playfulness again, said, "But why should you regret it more because I am a woman?" "Perhaps because we need that you should be better than we are." "But suppose we need that men should be better than we are?" said Gwendolen, with a little air of check. "That is rather a difficulty," said Deronda, smiling. "I suppose I should have said, we each of us think it would be better for the other to be good." "You see, I needed you to be better than I was, and you thought so," said Gwendolen, nodding and laughing while she put her horse forward and joined Grandcourt, who made no observation. "Don't you want to know what I had to say to Mr. Deronda?" said Gwendolen, whose own pride required her to account for her conduct. No," said Grandcourt, coldly. "Now that is the first impolite word you have spoken, that you don't wish to hear what I had to say," said Gwendolen, playing at a pout. "I wish to hear what you say to me, not to other men," said Grandcourt. "Then you wish to hear this. I wanted to make him tell me why he objected to my gambling, and he gave me a little sermon." "Yes, but excuse me the sermon." If Gwendolen imagined that Grandcourt cared about her speaking to Deronda, he wished her to understand that she was mistaken. But he was not fond of being told to ride on. She saw he was piqued, but did not mind. She had accomplished her object of speaking again to Deronda before he raised his hat and turned with the rest toward Diplow, while her lover attended her to Offendene, where he was to bid farewell before a whole day's absence on the unspecified journey. Grandcourt had spoken truth in calling the journey a bore. He was going by train to Gadsmere. End of chapter 29. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 30. No penitence and no confessional, no priest ordains it, yet they're forced to sit amid deep ashes of their vanished years. Imagine a rambling, patchy house, the best part built of gray stone and red-tiled, a round tower jutting at one of the corners, the mellow darkness of its conical roof surmounted by a weathercock making an agreeable object either amidst the gleams and greenth of summer or the low-hanging clouds and snowy branches of winter. the ground shady with spreading trees, a great tree flourishing on one side, backward some Scotch firs on a broken bank where the roots hung naked, and beyond a rookery. On the other side a pool overhung with bushes where the waterfowl fluttered and screamed. All around a vast meadow which might be called a park, bordered by an old plantation and guarded by stone ledges which looked like little prisons. Outside the gate the country, once entirely rural and lovely, now black with coal mines, was chiefly peopled by men and brethren with candles stuck in their hats, and with a diabolical complexion which laid them peculiarly open to suspicion in the eyes of the children at Gadsmere, Mrs. Glasher's 4 beautiful children, who had dwelt there for about 3 years. Now in November, when the flower beds were empty, the trees leafless, and the pool blackly shivering, one might have said that the place was somberly in keeping with the black roads and black mounds which seemed to put the district in mourning, except when the children were playing on the gravel, with the dogs for their companions. But Mrs. Glasher, under her present circumstances, liked Gadsmere as well as she would have liked any other abode. The complete seclusion of the place, which the unattractiveness of the country secured, was exactly to her taste. When she drove her 2 ponies with a wagonette full of children, there were no gentry in carriages to be met, only men of business in gigs. At church there were no eyes she cared to avoid, for the curate's wife and the curate himself were either ignorant of anything to her disadvantage, or ignored it. To them she was simply a widow lady, the tenant of Gadsmere, and the name of Grandcourt was of little interest in that district compared with the names of Fletcher and Gawcombe and the lessees of the collieries. It was full 10 years since the elopement of an Irish officer's beautiful wife with young Grandcourt, and a consequent duel where the bullets wounded the air only, had made some little noise. Most of those who remembered the affair now wondered what had become of that Mrs. Glasher, whose beauty and brilliancy had made her rather conspicuous to them in foreign places where she was known to be living with young Grandcourt. That he should have disentangled himself from that connection seemed only natural and desirable. As to her, it was thought that a woman who was understood to have forsaken her child along with her husband had probably sunk lower. Grandcourt had of course got weary of her. He was much given to the pursuit of women, but a man in his position would by this time desire to make a suitable marriage with the fair young daughter of a noble house. No one talked of Mrs. Glasher now, any more than they talked of the victim in a trial for manslaughter 10 years before. She was a lost vessel after whom nobody would send out an expedition of search. But Grandcourt was seen in harbor with his colors flying, registered as seaworthy as ever. Yet in fact Grandcourt had never disentangled himself from Mrs. Glasher. His passion for her had been the strongest and most lasting he had ever known, and though it was now as dead as the music of a cracked flute, it had left a certain dull disposedness which on the death of her husband 3 years before had prompted in him a vacillating notion of marrying her, in accordance with the understanding often expressed between them during the days of his first ardor. At that early time Grandcourt would willingly have paid for the freedom to be won by a divorce, but the husband would not oblige him, not wanting to be married again himself, and not wishing to have his domestic habits printed in evidence. The altered poise which the years had brought in Mrs. Glasher was just the reverse. At first she was comparatively careless about the possibility of marriage. It was enough that she had escaped from a disagreeable husband, and found a sort of bliss with a lover who had completely fascinated her, young, handsome, amorous, and living in the best style, with equipage and conversation of the kind to be expected in young men of fortune who have seen everything. She was an impassioned, vivacious woman, fond of adoration, exasperated by 5 years of marital rudeness, and the sense of release was so strong upon her that it stilled anxiety for more than she actually enjoyed. An equivocal position was of no importance to her then. She had no envy for the honors of a dull, disregarded wife. The one spot which spoiled her vision of her new pleasant world was the sense that she left her 3-year-old boy, who died 2 years afterward, and whose first tone, saying "Mamma," retained a difference from those of the children that came after. But now the years had brought many changes besides those in the contour of her cheek and throat, and that Grandcourt should marry her had become her dominant desire. The equivocal position which she had not minded about for herself was now telling upon her through her children, whom she loved with a devotion charged with the added passion of atonement. She had no repentance except in this direction. If Grandcourt married her, the children would be none the worse off for what had passed. They would see their mother in a dignified position, and they would be at no disadvantage with the world. Her son could be made his father's heir. It was yearning for this result which gave the supreme importance to Grandcourt's feeling for her. Her love for him had long resolved itself into anxiety that he should give her the unique, permanent claim of a wife, and she expected no other happiness in marriage than the satisfaction of her maternal love and pride, including her pride for herself in the presence of her children. For the sake of that result she was prepared even with a tragic firmness to endure anything quietly in marriage, and she had acuteness enough to cherish Grandcourt's flickering purpose negatively, by not molesting him with passionate appeals and with scene-making. In her, as in every one else who wanted anything of him, his incalculable turns and his tendency to harden under beseeching had created a reasonable dread. A slow discovery, of which no presentiment had been given in the bearing of a youthful lover with a fine line of face and the softest manners. But reticence had necessarily cost something to this impassioned woman, and she was the bitterer for it. There is no quailing, even that forced on the helpless and injured, which was not an ugly obverse. The withheld sting was gathering venom. She was absolutely dependent on Grandcourt, for though he had always been liberal in expenses for her, he had kept everything voluntary on his part. And with the goal of marriage before her, she would ask for nothing less. He had said that he would never settle anything except by will, and when she was thinking of alternatives for the future, it often occurred to her that even if she did not become Grandcourt's wife, he might never have a son who would have a legitimate claim on him, and the end might be that her son would be made heir to the best part of his estates. No son at that early age could promise to have more of his father's physique, but her becoming Grandcourt's wife was so far from being an extravagant notion of possibility that even Lush had entertained it, and had said that he would as soon bet on it as on any other likelihood with regard to his familiar companion. Lush, indeed, on inferring that Grandcourt had a preconception of using his residence at Diplow in order to win Miss Arrowpoint, had thought it well to fan that project, taking it as a tacit renunciation of the marriage with Mrs. Glasher, which had long been a mark for the hovering and wheeling of Grandcourt's caprice. But both prospects had been negatived by Gwendolen's appearance on the scene, and it was natural enough for Mrs. Glasher to enter with eagerness into Lush's plan of hindering that new danger by setting up a barrier in the mind of the girl who was being sought as a bride. She entered into it with an eagerness which had passion in it as well as purpose, some of the stored-up venom delivering itself in that way. After that she had heard from Lush of Gwendolen's departure, and the probability that all danger from her was got rid of, but there had been no letter to tell her that the danger had returned and had become a certainty. She had since then written to Grandcourt, as she did habitually, and he had been longer than usual in answering. She was inferring that he might intend coming to Gadsmere at the time when he was actually on the way, and she was not without hope. What construction of another's mind is not strong wishing equal to? That a certain sickening from that frustrated courtship might dispose him to slip the more easily into the old track of intention. Grandcourt had two grave purposes in coming to Gadsmere: to convey the news of his approaching marriage in person, in order to make this first difficulty final, and to get from Lydia his mother's diamonds, which long ago he had confided to her and wished her to wear. Her person suited diamonds, and made them look as if they were worth some of the money given for them. These particular diamonds were not mountains of light. They were mere peas and haricots for the ears, neck, and hair, but they were worth some thousands, and Grandcourt necessarily wished to have them for his wife. Formerly, when he had asked Lydia to put them into his keeping again, simply on the ground that they would be safer and ought to be deposited at the bank, she had quietly but absolutely refused, declaring that they were quite safe, and at last had said, If you ever marry another woman, I will give them up to her. Are you going to marry another woman?" At that time Grandcourt had no motive which urged him to persist, and he had this grace in him, that the disposition to exercise power either by cowing or disappointing others, or exciting in them a rage which they dared not express—a disposition which was active in him as other propensities became languid—had always been in abeyance before Lydia. A severe interpreter might say that the mere facts of their relation to each other, the melancholy position of this woman who depended on his will, made a standing banquet for his delight in dominating. But there was something else than this in his forbearance toward her. There was the surviving though metamorphosed effect of the power she had had over him. And it was this effect, the fitful dull lapse toward solicitations that once had the zest now missing from life, which had again and again inclined him to espouse a familiar past rather than rouse himself to the expectation of novelty. But now novelty had taken hold of him and urged him to make the most of it. Mrs. Glasher was seated in the pleasant room where she habitually passed her mornings with her children round her. It had a square projecting window, and looked on broad gravel and grass sloping toward a little brook that entered the pool. The top of a low black cabinet, the old oak table, the chairs in tawny leather, were littered with the children's toys, books, and garden garments, at which a maternal lady in pastel looked down from the walls with smiling indulgence. The children were all there. The three girls, seated round their mother near the window, were miniature portraits of her, dark-eyed, delicate-featured brunettes with a rich bloom on their cheeks, their little nostrils and eyebrows singularly finished as if they were tiny women, the eldest being barely 9. The boy was seated on the carpet at some distance, bending his blonde head over the animals from a Noah's Ark, admonishing them separately in a voice of threatening command, and occasionally licking the spotted ones to see if the colors would hold. Josephine, the eldest, was having her French lesson, and the others, with their dolls on their laps, sat demurely enough for images of the Madonna. Mrs. Glasher's toilette had been made very carefully. Each day now she said to herself that Grandcourt might come in. Her head, which, spite of emaciation, had an ineffaceable beauty in the fine profile, crisp curves of hair, and clearly marked eyebrows, rose impressively above her bronze-colored silk and velvet, and the gold necklace which Grandcourt had first clasped around her neck years ago. Not that she had any pleasure in her toilette. Her chief thought of herself seen in the glass was, "How changed!" But such good in life as remained to her she would keep. If her chief wish were fulfilled, she could imagine herself getting the comeliness of a matron fit for the highest rank. The little faces beside her, almost exact reductions of her own, seemed to tell of the blooming curves which had once been where now was sunken pallor. But the children kissed the pale cheeks and never found them deficient. That love was now the one end of her life. Suddenly Mrs. Glasher turned away her head from Josephine's book and listened. "Hush, dear, I think some one is coming." Henleigh, the boy, jumped up and said, "Mamma, is it the miller with my donkey?" He got no answer, and going up to his mamma's knee repeated his question in an insistent tone, but the door opened, and the servant announced Mr. Grandcourt. Mrs. Glasher rose in some agitation. Henleigh frowned at him in disgust at his not being the miller, and the three little girls lifted up their dark eyes to him timidly. They had none of them any particular liking for this friend of mamma's. In fact, when he had taken Mrs. Glasher's hand and then turned to put his other hand on Henleigh's head, that energetic scion began to beat the friend's arm away with his fists. The little girls submitted bashfully to be patted under the chin and kissed, but on the whole it seemed better to send them into the garden, where they were presently dancing and chatting with the dogs on the gravel. "How far are you come?" said Mrs. Glasher, as Grandcourt put away his hat and overcoat. "From Diplow," he answered slowly, seating himself opposite her and looking at her with an unnoting gaze which she noted. "You are tired, then?" "No. I rested at the junction. A hideous hole. These railway journeys are always a confounded bore. But I had coffee and smoked." Grandcourt drew out his handkerchief, rubbed his face, and in returning the handkerchief to his pocket, looked at his crossed knee and blameless boot, as if any stranger were opposite to him, instead of a woman quivering with a suspense which every word and look of his was to incline toward hope or dread. But he was really occupied with their interview and what it was likely to include. Imagine the difference in rate of emotion between this woman whom the years had worn to a mere conscious dependence and sharper eagerness, and this man whom they were dulling into a more neutral obstinacy. "I expected to see you. It was so long since I had heard from you. I suppose the weeks seem longer at Gadsmere than they do at Diplow," said Mrs. Glasher. She had a quick, incisive way of speaking that seemed to go with her features, as the tone and timbre of a violin go with its form. "Yes," drawled Grandcourt. "But you found the money paid into the bank?" "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Glasher curtly, tingling with impatience. Always before, at least she fancied so, Grandcourt had taken more notice of her and the children than he did to-day. "Yes," he resumed, playing with his whisker, and at first not looking at her. "The time has gone on at rather a rattling pace with me. Generally it is slow enough. But there has been a good deal happening, as you know." Here he turned his eyes upon her. "What do I know?" said she, sharply. He left a pause before he said, without change of manner, "That I was thinking of marrying. You saw Miss Harleth." "She told you that?" The pale cheeks looked even paler, perhaps from the fierce brightness in the eyes above them. "No. Lush told me," was the slow answer. It was as if the thumb-screw and the iron boot were being placed by creeping hands within sight of the expectant victim. "Good God! Say at once that you are going to marry her!" she burst out, passionately, her knees shaking and her hands tightly clasped. "Of course this kind of thing must happen some time or other, Lydia," said he. Really, now the thumb-screw was on, not wishing to make the pain worse. "You didn't always see the necessity." "Perhaps not. I see it now." In those few undertoned words of Grandcourt's she felt as absolute a resistance as if her thin fingers had been pushing at a fast-shut iron door. She knew her helplessness, and shrank from testing it by any appeal, shrank from crying in a dead ear and clinging to dead knees, only to see the immovable face and feel the rigid limbs. She did not weep nor speak. She was too hard pressed by the sudden certainty which had as much of chill sickness in it as of thought and emotion. The defeated clutch of struggling hope gave her in these first moments a horrible sensation. At last she rose, with a spasmodic effort, and, unconscious of everything but her wretchedness, pressed her forehead against the hard, cold glass of the window. The children, playing on the gravel, took this as a sign that she wanted them, and running forward, stood in front of her with their sweet faces upturned expectantly. This roused her. She shook her head at them, waved them off, and, overcome with this painful exertion, sank back in the nearest chair. Grandcourt had risen too. He was doubly annoyed, at the scene itself and at the sense that no imperiousness of his could save him from it. But the task had to be gone through, and there was the administrative necessity of arranging things so that there should be as little annoyance as possible in the future. He was leaning against the corner of the fireplace. She looked up at him and said, bitterly, "All this is of no consequence to you. I and the children are importunate creatures. You wish to get away again and be with Miss Harleth." "Don't make the affair more disagreeable than it need be, Lydia. It is of no use to harp on things that can't be altered. Of course it's deucedly disagreeable to me to see you making yourself miserable. I've taken this journey to tell you what you must make up your mind to. You and the children will be provided for as usual, and there's an end of it." Silence. She dared not answer. This woman with the intense, eager look had had the iron of the mother's anguish in her soul, and it made her sometimes capable of a repression harder than shrieking and struggle. but underneath the silence there was an outlash of hatred and vindictiveness. She wished that the marriage might make two others wretched besides herself. Presently he went on, "It will be better for you. You may go on living here. But I think of by and by settling a good sum on you and the children, and you can live where you like. There will be nothing for you to complain of then. Whatever happens, you will feel secure. Nothing could be done beforehand. Everything has gone on in a hurry." Grandcourt ceased his slow delivery of sentences. He did not expect her to thank him, but he considered that she might reasonably be contented, if it were possible for Lydia to be contented. She showed no change, and after a minute he said, "You have never had any reason to fear that I should be illiberal. I don't care a curse about the money." "If you did care about it, I suppose you would not give it us," said Lydia. The sarcasm was irrepressible. "That's a devilishly unfair thing to say," Grandcourt replied in a lower tone, "and I advise you not to say that sort of thing again." "Should you punish me by leaving the children in beggary?" In spite of herself, the one outlet of venom had brought the other. "There is no question about leaving the children in beggary," said Grandcourt, still in his low voice. "I advise you not to say things that you will repent of." "I am used to repenting," she said bitterly. "Perhaps you will repent. You have already repented of loving me." "All this will only make it uncommonly difficult for us to meet again. What friend have you besides me?" "Quite true." The words came like a low moan, and at the same moment there flashed through her the wish that after promising himself a better happiness than that he had had with her, he might feel a misery and loneliness which would drive him back to her to find some memory of a time when he was young, glad, and hopeful. But no, he would go scatheless. It was she that had to suffer. With this the scorching words were ended. Grandcourt had meant to stay till evening. He wished to curtail his visit, but there was no suitable train earlier than the one he had arranged to go by, and he had still to speak to Lydia on the second object of his visit, which like a second surgical operation seemed to require an interval. The hours had to go by, there was eating to be done, the children came in, all this mechanism of life had to be gone through with the dreary sense of constraint which is often felt in domestic quarrels of a commoner kind. To Lydia it was some slight relief for her stifled fury to have the children present. She felt a savage glory in their loveliness, as if it would taunt Grandcourt with his indifference to her and them, a secret darting of venom which was strongly imaginative. He acquitted himself with all the advantage of a man whose grace of bearing has long been molded on an experience of boredom, nursed the little Antonia, who sat with her hands crossed and eyes upturned to his bald head, which struck her as worthy of observation, and propitiated Henleigh by promising him a beautiful saddle and bridle. It was only the two eldest girls who had known him as a continual presence, and the intervening years had overlaid their infantine memories with a bashfulness which Grandcourt's bearing was not likely to dissipate. He and Lydia occasionally, in the presence of the servants, made a conventional remark; otherwise they never spoke. And the stagnant thought in Grandcourt's mind all the while was of his own infatuation in having given her those diamonds, which obliged him to incur the nuisance of speaking about them. He had an ingrained care for what he held to belong to his caste, and about property he liked to be lordly. Also he had a consciousness of indignity to himself in having to ask for anything in the world. But however he might assert his independence of Mrs. Glasher's past, he had made a past for himself which was a stronger yoke than any he could impose. He must ask for the diamonds which he had promised to Gwendolen. At last they were alone again, with the candles above them, face to face with each other. Grandcourt looked at his watch, and then said, in an apparently indifferent drawl, "There is one thing I had to mention, Lydia. My diamonds. You have them." "Yes, I have them," she answered promptly, rising and standing with her arms thrust down and her fingers threaded, while Grandcourt sat still. She had expected the topic, and made her resolve about it, but she meant to carry out her resolve if possible without exasperating him. During the hours of silence she had longed to recall the words which had only widened the breach between them. "They are in this house, I suppose?" "No, not in this house." "I thought you said you kept them by you." "When I said so it was true. They are in the bank at Dudley." "Get them away, will you? I must make an arrangement for your delivering them to some one." "Make no arrangement. They shall be delivered to the person you intended them for. I will make the arrangement." "What do you mean?" "What I say. I have always told you that I would give them up to your wife. I shall keep my word. She is not your wife yet." "This is foolery," said Grandcourt, with undertoned disgust. It was too irritating that this indulgence of Lydia had given her a sort of mastery over him in spite of dependent condition. She did not speak. He also rose now, but stood leaning against the mantelpiece with his side face toward her. "The diamonds must be delivered to me before my marriage," he began again. "What is your wedding day?" "The 10th. There is no time to be lost." "And where do you go after the marriage?" He did not reply except by looking more sullen. Presently he said, "You must appoint a day before then to get them from the bank and meet me, or somebody else I will commission. It's a great nuisance. Mention a day." "No, I shall not do that. They shall be delivered to her safely. I shall keep my word." "Do you mean to say," said Grandcourt, just audibly, turning to face her, "that you will not do as I tell you?" "Yes, I mean that," was the answer that leaped out, while her eyes flashed close to him. The poor creature was immediately conscious that if her words had any effect on her own lot, the effect must be mischievous, and might nullify all the remaining advantage of her long patience. But the word had been spoken. He was in a position the most irritating to him. He could not shake her nor touch her hostilely, and if he could, the process would not bring his mother's diamonds. He shrank from the only sort of threat that would frighten her, if she believed it, and in general there was nothing he hated more than to be forced into anything like violence, even in words. His will must impose itself without trouble. After looking at her for a moment, he turned his side face toward her again, leaning as before, and said, "Infernal idiots that women are!" "Why will you not tell me where you are going after the marriage? I could be at the wedding if I liked, and learn in that way," said Lydia, not shrinking from the one suicidal form of threat within her power. "Of course, if you like, you can play the mad woman," said Grandcourt, with sotto voce scorn. "It is not to be supposed that you will wait to think what good will come of it, or what you owe to me." He was in a state of disgust and embitterment quite new in the history of their relation to each other. It was undeniable that this woman, whose life he had allowed to send such deep suckers into his, had a terrible power of annoyance in her, and the rash hurry of his proceedings had left her opportunities open. His pride saw very ugly possibilities threatening it, and he stood for several minutes in silence reviewing the situation, considering how he could act upon her. Unlike himself, she was of a direct nature, with certain simple, strongly colored tendencies, and there was one often experienced effect which he thought he could count upon now. As Sir Hugo had said of him, Grandcourt knew how to play his cards upon occasion. He did not speak again, but looked at his watch, rang the bell, and ordered the vehicle to be brought round immediately. Then he removed farther from her, walked as if in expectation of a summons, and remained silent without turning his eyes upon her. She was suffering the horrible conflict of self-reproach and tenacity. She saw beforehand Grandcourt leaving her without even looking at her again, herself left behind in lonely uncertainty, hearing nothing from him, not knowing whether she had done her children harm, feeling that she had perhaps made him hate her—all the wretchedness of a creature who had defeated her own motives. and yet she could not bear to give up a purpose which was a sweet morsel to her vindictiveness. If she had not been a mother, she would willingly have sacrificed herself to her revenge, to what she felt to be the justice of hindering another from getting happiness by willingly giving her over to misery. The two dominant passions were at struggle. She must satisfy them both. "Don't let us part in anger, Henleigh," she began, without changing her voice or attitude. "It is a very little thing I ask. If I were refusing to give anything up that you call yours, it would be different. That would be a reason for treating me as if you hated me. But I ask such a little thing. If you will tell me where you are going on the wedding day, I will take care that the diamonds shall be delivered to her without scandal. Without scandal," she repeated entreatingly. "Such preposterous whims make a woman odious," said Grandcourt, not giving way in look or movement. "What is the use of talking to mad people?" "Yes, I am foolish. Loneliness has made me foolish. Indulge me." Sobs rose as she spoke. "If you will indulge me in this one folly, I will be very meek. I will never trouble you." She burst into hysterical crying, and said again, almost with a scream, "I will be very meek after that." There was a strange mixture of acting and reality in this passion. She kept hold of her purpose as a child might tighten its hand over a small stolen thing, crying and denying all the while. Even Grandcourt was wrought upon by surprise. This capricious wish, this childish violence, was as unlike Lydia's bearing as it was incongruous with her person. Both had always had a stamp of dignity on them, yet she seemed more manageable in this state than in her former attitude of defiance. He came close up to her again and said in his low, imperious tone, "Be quiet and hear what I tell you. I will never forgive you if you present yourself again and make a scene." She pressed her handkerchief against her face, and when she could speak firmly, said, in the muffled voice that follows sobbing, "I will not, if you will let me have my way. I promise you not to thrust myself forward again. I have never broken my word to you. How many have you broken to me? When you gave me the diamonds to wear, you were not thinking of having another wife. And now I give them up. I don't reproach you. I only ask you to let me give them up in my own way. Have I not borne it well? Everything is to be taken away from me. And when I ask for a straw, a chip, you deny it me." She had spoken rapidly, but after a little pause she said more slowly, her voice freed from its muffled tone, "I will not bear to have it denied me." Grandcourt had a baffling sense that he had to deal with something like madness. He could only govern by giving way. The servant came to say the fly was ready. When the door was shut again, Grandcourt said sullenly, "We are going to Ryelands, then." "They shall be delivered to her there," said Lydia, with decision. "Very well. I am going." He felt no inclination even to take her hand. She had annoyed him too sorely, but now that she had gained her point, she was prepared to humble herself that she might propitiate him. "Forgive me. I will never vex you again," she said with beseeching looks. Her inward voice said distinctly, "It is only I who have to forgive." Yet she was obliged to ask forgiveness. "You had better keep that promise. You have made me feel uncommonly ill with your folly," said Grandcourt, apparently choosing this statement as the strongest possible use of language. "Poor thing!" cried Lydia, with a faint smile. Was he aware of the minor fact that he made her feel ill this morning? But with the quick transition natural to her, she was now ready to coax him if he would let her, that they might part in some degree reconciled. She ventured to lay her hand on his shoulder, and he did not move away from her. She had so far succeeded in alarming him that he was not sorry for these proofs of returned subjection. "Light a cigar," she said soothingly, taking the case from his breast pocket and opening it. Amidst such caressing signs of mutual fear they parted. The effect that clung and gnawed within Grandcourt was a sense of imperfect mastery. End of chapter 30. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 31. A wild dedication of yourselves to unpathed waters, undreamed shores. Shakespeare. On the day when Gwendolen Harleth was married and became Mrs. Grandcourt, the morning was clear and bright, and while the sun was low, a slight frost crisped the leaves. The bridal party was worth seeing, and half Pennicote turned out to see it, lining the pathway up to the church. An old friend of the rector's performed the marriage ceremony, the rector himself acting as father, to the great advantage of the procession. Only two faces, it was remarked, showed signs of sadness, Mrs. Davilow's and Anna's. The mother's delicate eyelids were pink as if she had been crying half the night, and no one was surprised that, splendid as the match was, she should feel the parting from a daughter who was the flower of her children and of her own life. It was less understood why Anna should be troubled when she was being so well set off by the bridesmaid's dress. Every one else seemed to reflect the brilliancy of the occasion, the bride most of all. Of her it was agreed that as to figure and carriage she was worthy to be a lady of title. As to face, perhaps it might be thought that a title required something more rosy, but the bridegroom himself not being fresh-colored, being indeed, as the miller's wife observed, very much of her own husband's complexion, the match was the more complete. Anyhow, he must be very fond of her, and it was to be hoped that he would never cast it up to her that she had been going out to service as a governess, and her mother to live at Sawyer's Cottage, vicissitudes which had been much spoken of in the village. The miller's daughter of 14 could not believe that high gentry behaved badly to their wives, but her mother instructed her, "Oh, child, men's men, gentle or simple, they're much of a muchness. I've heard my mother say Squire Pelton used to take his dogs and a long whip into his wife's room and flog 'em there to frighten her. And my mother was lady's maid there at the very time." "That's unlucky talk for a wedding, Mrs. Girdle," said the tailor. "A quarrel may end with the whip, but it begins with the tongue, and it's the women have got the most of that." "The Lord gave it 'em to use, I suppose," said Mrs. Girdle. "He never meant you to have it all your own way." "By what I can make out from the gentleman as attends to the grooming at Offendene," said the tailor, "this Mr. Grandcourt has wonderful little tongue. Everything must be done dummy-like without his ordering." "Then he's the more whip, I doubt," said Mrs. Girdle. "She's got tongue enough, I warrant her. See, there they come out together." "What wonderful long corners she's got to her eyes," said the tailor. "She makes you feel comical when she looks at you." Gwendolen, in fact, never showed more elasticity in her bearing, more luster in her long brown glance. She had the brilliancy of strong excitement, which will sometimes come even from pain. It was not pain, however, that she was feeling. She had wrought herself up to much the same condition as that in which she stood at the gambling table when Deronda was looking at her, and she began to lose. There was an enjoyment in it. Whatever uneasiness a growing conscience had created was disregarded as an ailment might have been, amidst the gratification of that ambitious vanity and desire for luxury within her which it would take a great deal of slow poisoning to kill. This morning she could not have said truly that she repented her acceptance of Grandcourt, or that any fears in hazy perspective could hinder the glowing effect of the immediate scene in which she was the central object. That she was doing something wrong, that a punishment might be hanging over her, that the woman to whom she had given a promise and broken it was thinking of her in bitterness and misery with a just reproach, that Deronda, with his way of looking into things, very likely despised her for marrying Grandcourt, as he had despised her for gambling. Above all, that the cord which united her with this lover, and which she had heretofore held by the hand, was now being flung over her neck. All this yeasty mingling of dimly understood facts with vague but deep impressions, and with images half real, half fantastic, had been disturbing her during the weeks of her engagement. Was that agitating experience nullified this morning? No. It was surmounted and thrust down with a sort of exulting defiance, as she felt herself standing at the game of life with many eyes upon her, daring everything to win much, or if to lose, still with éclat, with a sense of importance. But this morning a losing destiny for herself did not press upon her as a fear. She thought that she was entering on a fuller power of managing circumstances, with all the official strength of marriage which some women made so poor a use of. That intoxication of youthful egoism out of which she had been shaken by trouble, humiliation, and a new sense of culpability, had returned upon her under a newly fed strength of the old fumes. She did not in the least present the idea of the tearful, tremulous bride. Poor Gwendolen, whom some had judged much too forward and instructed in the world's ways. With her erect head and elastic footstep, she was walking among illusions, and yet too there was an under-consciousness of her that she was a little intoxicated. "Thank God you bear it so well, my darling," said Mrs. Davilow, when she had helped Gwendolen to doff her bridal white and put on her traveling dress. All the trembling had been done by the poor mother, and her agitation urged Gwendolen doubly to take the morning as if it were a triumph. "Why, you might have said that if I had been going to Mrs. Mompert's, you dear, sad, incorrigible mamma," said Gwendolen, just putting her hands to her mother's cheeks with laughing tenderness, then retreating a little and spreading out her arms as if to exhibit herself. "Here am I, Mrs. Grandcourt. What else would you have me but what I am sure to be? You know you were ready to die with vexation when you thought that I would not be Mrs. Grandcourt." "Hush, hush, my child, for heaven's sake," said Mrs. Davilow, almost in a whisper. "How can I help feeling it when I am parting from you? But I can bear anything gladly if you are happy." "Not gladly, mamma, no," said Gwendolen, shaking her head with a bright smile. "Willingly you would bear it, but always sorrowfully. Sorrowing is your sauce. You can take nothing without it." Then clasping her mother's shoulders and raining kisses first on one cheek and then on the other between her words, she said gaily, "And you shall sorrow over my having everything at my beck, and enjoying everything glorious, splendid houses, and horses, and diamonds. I shall have diamonds, and going to court, and being lady certainly, and lady perhaps, and grand here, and tantivy there, and always loving you better than anybody else in the world." "My sweet child, but I shall not be jealous if you love your husband better, and he will expect to be first." Gwendolen thrust out her lips and chin with a pretty grimace, saying, "Rather a ridiculous expectation. However, I don't mean to treat him ill, unless he deserves it." Then the two fell into a clinging embrace, and Gwendolen could not hinder a rising sob when she said, "I wish you were going with me, mamma." But the slight dew on her long eyelashes only made her the more charming when she gave her hand to Grandcourt to be led to the carriage. The rector looked in on her to give a final "Good-bye, God bless you, we shall see you again before long," and then returned to Mrs. Davilow, saying half cheerfully, half solemnly, "Let us be thankful, Fanny. She is in a position well suited to her, and beyond what I should have dared to hope for. And few women can have been chosen more entirely for their own sake. You should feel yourself a happy mother." There was a railway journey of some 50 miles before the new husband and wife reached the station near Ryelands. The sky had veiled itself since the morning, and it was hardly more than twilight when they entered the park gates. But still Gwendolen, looking out of the carriage window, as they drove rapidly along, could see the grand outlines and the nearer beauties of the scene: the long winding drive bordered with evergreens backed by huge gray stems; then the opening of wide grassy spaces and undulations studded with dark clumps; till at last came a wide level where the white house could be seen, with a hanging wood for a background and the rising and sinking balustrade of a terrace in front. Gwendolen had been at her liveliest during the journey, chatting incessantly, ignoring any change in their mutual position since yesterday, and Grandcourt had been rather ecstatically quiescent while she turned his gentle seizure of her hand into a grasp of his hand by both hers, with an increased vivacity as of a kitten that will not sit quiet to be petted. She was really getting somewhat febrile in her excitement, and now in this drive through the park her usual susceptibility to changes of light and scenery helped to make her heart palpitate newly. Was it at the novelty simply, or to the almost incredible fulfillment about to be given to her girlish dreams of being somebody, walking through her own furlong of corridor and under her own ceilings of an out-of-sight loftiness, where her own painted spring was shedding painted flowers and her own foreshortened zephyrs were blowing their trumpets over her, while her own servants, lackeys in clothing but men in bulk and shape, were as naught in her presence, and revered the propriety of her insolence to them, being in short the heroine of an admired play without the pains of art? Was it alone the closeness of this fulfillment which made her heart flutter? Or was it some dim forecast, the incessant penetration of suppressed experience, mixing the expectation of a triumph with the dread of a crisis? Hers was one of the natures in which exultation inevitably carries an infusion of dread ready to curdle and declare itself. She fell silent in spite of herself as they approached the gates, and when her husband said, "Here we are at home," and for the first time kissed her on the lips, she hardly knew of it. It was no more than the passive acceptance of a greeting in the midst of an absorbing show. Was not all her hurrying life of the last 3 months a show in which her consciousness was a wondering spectator? After the half-willful excitement of the day, a numbness had come over her personality. But there was a brilliant light in the hall, warmth, matting, carpets, full-length portraits, Olympian statues, assiduous servants. Not many servants, however, only a few from Diplow, in addition to those constantly in charge of the house. And Gwendolen's new maid, who had come with her, was taken under guidance by the housekeeper. Gwendolen felt herself being led by Grandcourt along a subtly scented corridor into an anteroom where she saw an open doorway sending out a rich glow of light and color. "These are our dens," said Grandcourt. "You will like to be quiet here till dinner. We shall dine early." He pressed her hand to his lips and moved away, more in love than he had ever expected to be. Gwendolen yielded up her hat and mantle, threw herself into a chair by the glowing hearth, and saw herself repeated in glass panels with all her faint green satin surroundings. The housekeeper had passed into this boudoir from the adjoining dressing-room and seemed disposed to linger, Gwendolen thought, in order to look at the new mistress of Ryelands, who, however, being impatient for solitude, said to her, "Will you tell Hudson when she has put out my dress to leave everything? I shall not want her again unless I ring." The housekeeper, coming forward, said, "Here is a packet, madam, which I was ordered to give into nobody's hands but yours when you were alone. The person who brought it said it was a present particularly ordered by Mr. Grandcourt, but he was not to know of its arrival till he saw you wear it. Excuse me, madam, I felt it right to obey orders." Gwendolen took the packet and let it lie on her lap till she heard the doors close. It came into her mind that the packet might contain the diamonds which Grandcourt had spoken of as being deposited somewhere and to be given to her on her marriage. In this moment of confused feeling and creeping luxurious languor she was glad of this diversion, glad of such an event as having her own diamonds to try on. Within all the sealed paper coverings was a box, but within the box there was a jewel case, and now she felt no doubt that she had the diamonds. But on opening the case, in the same instant that she saw them gleam, she saw a letter lying above them. She knew the handwriting of the address. It was as if an adder had lain on them. Her heart gave a leap which seemed to have spent all her strength, and as she opened the bit of thin paper, it shook with the trembling of her hands. But it was legible as print, and thrust its words upon her. "These diamonds, which were once given with ardent love to Lydia Glasher, she passes on to you. You have broken your word to her, that you might possess what was hers. Perhaps you think of being happy, as she once was, and of having beautiful children such as hers, who will thrust hers aside. God is too just for that. The man you have married has a withered heart. His best young love was mine. You could not take that from me when you took the rest. It is dead. But I am the grave in which your chance of happiness is buried as well as mine. You had your warning. You have chosen to injure me and my children. He had meant to marry me. He would have married me at last if you had not broken your word. You will have your punishment. I desire it with all my soul. Will you give him this letter to set him against me and ruin us more, me and my children? Shall you like to stand before your husband with these diamonds on you, and these words of mine and his thoughts in yours? Will he think you have any right to complain when he has made you miserable? You took him with your eyes open. The willing wrong you have done me will be your curse." It seemed at first as if Gwendolen's eyes were spellbound in reading the horrible words of the letter over and over again as a doom of penance, but suddenly a new spasm of terror made her lean forward and stretch out the paper toward the fire, lest accusation and proof at once should meet all eyes. It flew like a feather from her trembling fingers and was caught up in a great draught of flame. In her movement the casket fell on the floor and the diamonds rolled out. She took no notice, but fell back in her chair again helpless. She could not see the reflections of herself then. They were like so many women, petrified white. But coming near herself, you might have seen the tremor in her lips and hands. She sat so for a long while, knowing little more than that she was feeling ill, and that those written words kept repeating themselves to her. Truly here were poisoned gems, and the poison had entered into this poor young creature. After that long while there was a tap at the door, and Grandcourt entered, dressed for dinner. The sight of him brought a new nervous shock, and Gwendolen screamed again and again with hysterical violence. He had expected to see her dressed and smiling, ready to be led down. He saw her pallid, shrieking as it seemed with terror, the jewels scattered around her on the floor. Was it a fit of madness? In some form or other the Furies had crossed his threshold. End of chapter 31. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 32. In all ages it hath been a favorite text that a potent love hath the nature of an isolated fatality, whereto the mind's opinions and wonted resolves are altogether alien. As for example Daphnis, his frenzy, wherein it had availed him to have been convinced of Heracles, his doctrine, or the filter-bred passion of Tristan, who, though he had been as deep as Duns Scotus, would have had his reasoning marred by that cup too much. Or Romeo in his sudden taking for Juliet, wherein any objections he might have held against Ptolemy had made little difference to his discourse under the balcony. Yet all love is not such, even though potent. Nay, this passion hath as large scope as any for allying itself with every operation of the soul, so that it shall acknowledge and affect from the imagined light of unproven firmaments, and have its scale set to the grander orbits of what hath been and shall be. Deronda, on his return to town, could assure Sir Hugo of his having lodged in Grandcourt's mind a distinct understanding that he could get £50,000 by giving up a prospect which was probably distant and not absolutely certain. But he had no further sign of Grandcourt's disposition in the matter than that he was evidently inclined to keep up friendly communications. "And what did you think of the future bride on a nearer survey?" said Sir Hugo. "I thought better of her than I did in Leubronn. Roulette was not a good setting for her. It brought out something of the demon. At Diplow she seemed much more womanly and attractive, less hard and self-possessed. I thought her mouth and eyes had quite a different expression." "Don't flirt with her too much, Dan," said Sir Hugo, meaning to be agreeably playful. If you make Grandcourt savage when they come to the Abbey at Christmas, it will interfere with my affairs." "I can stay in town, sir." "No, no, Lady Mallinger and the children can't do without you at Christmas. Only don't make mischief, unless you can get up a duel, and manage to shoot Grandcourt, which might be worth a little inconvenience." "I don't think you ever saw me flirt," said Deronda, not amused. "Oh, haven't I, though?" said Sir Hugo, provokingly. "You are always looking tenderly at the women, and talking to them in a Jesuitical way. You are a dangerous young fellow, a kind of Lovelace who will make the Clarisses run after you instead of you running after them." What was the use of being exasperated at a tasteless joke? Only the exasperation comes before the reflection on utility. Few friendly remarks are more annoying than the information that we are always seeming to do what we never mean to do. Sir Hugo's notion of flirting, it was to be hoped, was rather peculiar. For his own part, Deronda was sure that he had never flirted. But he was glad that the baronet had no knowledge about the repurchase of Gwendolen's necklace to feed his taste for this kind of rallying. He would be on his guard in future, for example in his behavior at Mrs. Meyrick's, where he was about to pay his first visit since his arrival from Leubronn, for Mirah was certainly a creature in whom it was difficult not to show a tender kind of interest both by looks and speech. Mrs. Meyrick had not failed to send Deronda a report of Mirah's well-being in her family. "We are getting fonder of her every day," she had written. "At breakfast time we all look toward the door with expectation to see her come in, and we watch her and listen to her as if she were a native from a new country. I have not heard a word from her lips that gives me a doubt about her. She is quite contented and full of gratitude. My daughters are learning from her, and they hope to get her other pupils, for she is anxious not to eat the bread of idleness, but to work like my girls. Mab says our life has become like a fairy tale, and all she is afraid of is that Mirah will turn into a nightingale again and fly away from us. Her voice is just perfect, not loud and strong, but searching and melting like the thoughts of what has been. That is the way old people like me feel a beautiful voice." But Mrs. Meyrick did not enter into particulars which would have required her to say that Amy and Mab, who had accompanied Mirah to the synagogue, found the Jewish faith less reconcilable with their wishes in her case than that of Scott's Rebecca. They kept silence out of delicacy to Mirah, with whom her religion was too tender a subject to be touched lightly. But after a while Amy, who was much of a practical reformer, could not restrain a question. "Excuse me, Mirah, but does it seem quite right to you that the women should sit behind rails in a gallery apart?" "Yes, I never thought of anything else," said Mirah, with mild surprise. "And you like better to see the men with their hats on?" said Mab, cautiously proposing the smallest item of difference. "Oh, yes, I like what I have always seen there, because it brings back to me the same feelings, the feelings I would not part with for anything else in the world." After this, any criticism, whether of doctrine or practice, would have seemed to these generous little people an inhospitable cruelty. Mirah's religion was of one fiber with her affections, and had never presented itself to her as a set of propositions. "She says herself she is a very bad Jewess, and does not half know her people's religion," said Amy, when Mirah was gone to bed. "Perhaps it would gradually melt away from her, and she would pass into Christianity like the rest of the world if she got to love us very much, and never found her mother. It is so strange to be of the Jews' religion now." "Oh, oh, oh!" cried Mab. "I wish I were not such a hideous Christian. How can an ugly Christian who is always dropping her work convert a beautiful Jewess who has not a fault?" "It may be wicked of me," said shrewd Kate, "but I cannot help wishing that her mother may not be found. There might be something unpleasant." "Oh, don't think it, my dear," said Mrs. Meyrick. "I believe Mirah is cut out after the pattern of her mother. And what a joy it would be to her to have such a daughter brought back again. But a mother's feelings are not worth reckoning, I suppose." She shot a mischievous glance at her own daughters. "And a dead mother is worth more than a living one?" "Well, and so she may be, little mother," said Kate, "but we would rather hold you cheaper and have you alive." Not only the Meyricks, whose various knowledge had been acquired by the irregular foraging to which clever girls have usually been reduced, But Deronda himself, with all his masculine instruction, had been roused by this apparition of Mirah to the consciousness of knowing hardly anything about modern Judaism or the inner Jewish history. The chosen people have been commonly treated as a people chosen for the sake of somebody else, and their thinking as something, no matter exactly what, that ought to have been entirely otherwise. And Deronda, like his neighbors, had regarded Judaism as a sort of eccentric fossilized form which an accomplished man might dispense with studying and leave to specialists. But Mirah, with her terrified flight from one parent and her yearning after the other, had flashed on him the hitherto neglected reality that Judaism was something still throbbing in human lives, still making for them the only conceivable vesture of the world. And in the idling excursion on which he immediately afterward set out with Sir Hugo, he began to look for the outsides of synagogues and the title of books about the Jews. This awakening of a new interest, this passing from the supposition that we hold the right opinions on a subject that we are careless about, to a sudden care for it, and a sense that our opinions were ignorance, is an effectual remedy for ennui, which unhappily cannot be secured on a physician's prescription. But Deronda had carried it with him, and endured his weeks of lounging all the better. It was on this journey that he first entered a Jewish synagogue, at Frankfort, where his party rested on a Friday. In exploring the Judengasse, which he had seen long before, he remembered well enough its picturesque old houses. What his eyes chiefly dwelt on now were the human types there, and his thought, busily connecting them with the past phases of their race, stirred that fibre of historic sympathy which had helped to determine in him certain traits worth mentioning for those who are interested in his future. True, when a young man has a fine person, no eccentricity of manners, the education of a gentleman, and a present income, it is not customary to feel a prying curiosity about his way of thinking or his peculiar tastes. He may very well be settled in life as an agreeable, clever young fellow without passing a special examination on those heads. Later, when he is getting rather slovenly and portly, his peculiarities are more distinctly discerned, and it is taken as a mercy if they are not highly objectionable. But any one wishing to understand the effect of after events on Deronda should know a little more of what he was at 25 than was evident in ordinary intercourse. It happened that the very vividness of his impressions had often made him the more enigmatic to his friends, and had contributed to an apparent indefiniteness in his sentiments. His early wakened sensibility and reflectiveness had developed into a many-sided sympathy, which threatened to hinder any persistent course of action. As soon as he took up any antagonism, though only in thought, he seemed to himself like the Sabine warriors in the memorable story, with nothing to meet his spear but flesh of his flesh and objects that he loved. His imagination had so wrought itself to the habit of seeing things as they probably appeared to others, that a strong partisanship, unless it were against an immediate oppression, had become an insincerity for him. His plenteous flexible sympathy had ended by falling into one current with that reflective analysis which tends to neutralize sympathy. Few men were able to keep themselves clearer of vices than he, yet he hated vices mildly, being used to think of them less in the abstract than as a part of mixed human natures having an individual history, which it was the bent of his mind to trace with understanding and pity. With the same innate balance, he was fervidly democratic in his feeling for the multitude, and yet, through his affections and imagination, intensely conservative. Voracious of speculations on government and religion, yet both to part with long-sanctioned forms which for him were quick with memories and sentiments that no argument could lay dead. We fall on the leaning side, and Deronda suspected himself of loving too well the losing causes of the world. Martyrdom changes sides, and he was in danger of changing with it, having a strong repugnance to taking up that clue of success which the order of the world often forces upon us and makes it treason against the common weal to reject. And yet his fear of falling into an unreasoning narrow hatred made a check for him. He apologized for the airs of privilege. He shrank with dislike from the loser's bitterness and the denunciatory tone of the unacceptable innovator. A too reflective and diffusive sympathy was in danger of paralyzing in him that indignation against wrong and that selectness of fellowship which are the conditions of moral force, And in the last few years of confirmed manhood he had become so keenly aware of this, that what he most longed for was either some external event or some inward light that would urge him into a definite line of action and compress his wandering energy. He was ceasing to care for knowledge. He had no ambition for practice, unless they could both be gathered up into one current with his emotions. And he dreaded, as if it were a dwelling place of lost souls, that dead anatomy of culture which turns the universe into a mere ceaseless answer to queries, and knows, not everything, but everything else about everything, as if one should be ignorant of nothing concerning the scent of violets except the scent itself for which one had no nostril. But how and whence was the needed event to come? The influence that would justify partiality and make him what he longed to be, yet was unable to make himself, an organic part of social life instead of roaming in it like a yearning disembodied spirit, stirred with a vague social passion, but without fixed local habitation to render fellowship real? To make a little difference for the better was what he was not contented to live without. But how to make it? It is one thing to see your road, another to cut it. He found some of the fault in his birth and the way he had been brought up, which had laid no special demands on him, and had given him no fixed relationship except one of a doubtful kind. But he did not attempt to hide from himself that he had fallen into a meditative numbness, and was gliding farther and farther from that life of practically energetic sentiment which he would have proclaimed, if he had been inclined to proclaim anything, to be the best of all life, and for himself the only way worth living. He wanted some way of keeping emotion and its progeny of sentiments, which make the savors of life, substantial and strong in the face of a reflectiveness that threatened to nullify all differences. To pound the objects of sentiment into small dust, yet keep sentiment alive and active, was something like the famous recipe for making cannon: to first take a round hole and then enclose it with iron. Whatever you do, keeping fast hold of your round hole. Yet how distinguish what our will may wisely save in its completeness from the heaping of cat mummies and the expensive cult of enshrined putrefactions? Something like this was the common undercurrent in Deronda's mind while he was reading law or imperfectly attending to polite conversation. Meanwhile he had not set about one function in particular with zeal and steadiness, not an admirable experience to be proposed as an ideal, but a form of struggle before break of day which some young men since the patriarch have had to pass through, with more or less of bruising, if not laming. I have said that under his calm exterior he had a fervor which made him easily feel the presence of poetry in everyday events, and the forms of the Judengasse, rousing the sense of union with what is remote, set him musing on two elements of our historic life which that sense raises into the same region of poetry: the faint beginnings of faiths and institutions, and their obscure lingering decay, the dust and withered remnants with which they are apt to be covered, only enhancing for the awakened perception the impressiveness either of a sublimely penetrating life, as in the twin green leaves that will become the sheltering tree, or of a pathetic inheritance in which all the grandeur and the glory have become a sorrowing memory. This imaginative stirring, as he turned out of the Judengasse and continued to saunter in the warm evening air, meaning to find his way to the synagogue, neutralized the repellent effect of certain ugly little incidents on his way. Turning into an old bookshop to ask the exact time of service at the synagogue, he was affectionately directed by a precocious Jewish youth, who entered cordially into his wanting, not the fine new building of the Reformed, but the old rabbinical school of the Orthodox, and then cheated him like a pure Teuton, only with more amenity in his charge for a book, quite out of request as one nicht so leicht zu bekommen. Meanwhile, at the opposite counter, a deaf and grisly tradesman was casting a flinty look at certain cards, apparently combining advantages of business with religion, and shoutingly proposed to him in a Jew dialect by a dingy man in a tall coat hanging from neck to heel, a bag in hand, and a broad low hat surmounting his chosen nose, who had no sooner disappeared than another dingy man of the same pattern issued from the background glooms of the shop, and also shouted in the same dialect. In fact, Deronda saw various queer-looking Israelites not altogether without guile, and just distinguishable from queer-looking Christians of the same mixed morale. In his anxiety about Mirah's relatives, he had lately been thinking of vulgar Jews with a sort of personal alarm. But a little comparison will often diminish our surprise and disgust at the aberrations of Jews and other dissidents whose lives do not offer a consistent or lovely pattern of their creed. And this evening Deronda, becoming more conscious that he was falling into unfairness and ridiculous exaggeration, began to use that corrective comparison. He paid his thaler too much without prejudice to his interest in the Hebrew destiny, or his wish to find the rabbinische Schule, which he arrived at by sunset, and entered with a good congregation of men. He happened to take his seat in a line with an elderly man from whom he was distant enough to glance at him more than once as rather a noticeable figure, his ample white beard and felt hat framing a profile of that fine contour which may as easily be Italian as Hebrew. He returned Deronda's notice till at last their eyes met, an undesirable chance with unknown persons, and a reason to Deronda for not looking again. But he immediately found an open prayer-book pushed toward him and had to bow his thanks. However, the congregation had mustered, the reader had mounted to the almemor or platform, and the service began. Deronda, having looked enough at the German translation of the Hebrew in the book before him to know that he was chiefly hearing Psalms and Old Testament passages or phrases, gave himself up to that strongest effect of chanted liturgies which is independent of detailed verbal meaning, like the effect of an Allegri's Miserere or a Palestrina's Magnificat. The most powerful movement of feeling with the liturgy is the prayer which seeks for nothing special, but as a yearning to escape from the limitations of our own weakness and an invocation of all good to enter and abide with us, or else a self-oblivious lifting up of gladness, a gloria in excelsis, that such good exists, both the yearning and the exaltation gathering their utmost force from the sense of communion in a form which has expressed them both for long generations of struggling fellow men. The Hebrew liturgy, like others, has its transitions of litany, lyric, proclamation, dry statement, and blessing. But this evening all were one for Deronda. The chant of the Chazares, or reader's grand, wide-ranging voice with its passage from monotony to sudden cries, the outburst of sweet boys' voices from the little choir, the devotional swaying of men's bodies backward and forward, the very commonness of the building and the shabbiness of the scene, where a national faith which had penetrated the thinking of half the world and molded the splendid forms of that world's religion was finding a remote, obscure echo. All were blent for him as one expression of a binding history, tragic and yet glorious. He wondered at the strength of his own feeling. It seemed beyond the occasion, what one might imagine to be a divine influx in the darkness, before there was any vision to interpret. The whole scene was a coherent strain, its burden a passionate regret, which, if he had known the liturgy for the day of reconciliation, he might have clad in its authentic burden. Happy the eye which saw all these things, but verily to hear only of them afflicts our soul. Happy the eye that saw our temple and the joy of our congregation, but verily to hear only of them afflicts our soul. Happy the eye that saw the fingers when tuning every kind of song, but verily to hear only of them afflicts our soul. But with the cessation of the devotional sounds and the movement of many indifferent faces and vulgar figures before him, there darted into his mind the frigid idea that he had probably been alone in his feeling, and perhaps the only person in the congregation for whom the service was more than a dull routine. There was just time for this chilling thought before he had bowed to his civil neighbor and was moving away with the rest, when he felt a hand on his arm, and turning with the rather unpleasant sensation which this abrupt sort of claim is apt to bring, he saw close to him the white-bearded face of that neighbor, who said to him in German, "Excuse me, young gentleman, allow me. What is your parentage? Your mother's family? Her maiden name?" Deronda had a strongly resistant feeling. He was inclined to shake off hastily the touch on his arm. But he managed to slip it away and said coldly, "I am an Englishman." The questioner looked at him dubiously still for an instant. then just lifted his hat and turned away. Whether under a sense of having made a mistake or of having been repulsed, Deronda was uncertain. In his walk back to the hotel he tried to still any uneasiness on the subject by reflecting that he could not have acted differently. How could he say that he did not know the name of his mother's family to that total stranger, who indeed had taken an unwarrantable liberty in the abruptness of his question, dictated probably by some fancy of likeness such as often occurs without real significance? The incident, he said to himself, was trivial. But whatever import it might have, his inward shrinking on the occasion was too strong for him to be sorry that he had cut it short. It was a reason, however, for his not mentioning the synagogue to the Mallingers, in addition to his usual inclination to reticence on anything that the baronet would have been likely to call quixotic enthusiasm. Hardly any man could be more good-natured than Sir Hugo. Indeed, in his kindliness, especially to women, he did actions which others would have called romantic, but he never took a romantic view of them, and in general smiled at the introduction of motives on a grand scale, or of reasons that lay very far off. This was the point of strongest difference between him and Deronda, who rarely ate at breakfast without some silent discursive flight after grounds for filling up his day according to the practice of his contemporaries. This halt at Frankfort was taken on their way home, and its impressions were kept the more actively vibrating in him by the duty of caring for Mirah's welfare. That question about his parentage, which if he had not both inwardly and outwardly shaken it off as trivial, would have seemed a threat rather than a promise of revelation, and reinforced his anxiety as to the effect of finding Mirah's relatives, and his resolve to proceed with caution. If he made any unpleasant discovery, was he bound to a disclosure that might cast a new net of trouble around her? He had written to Mrs. Meyrick to announce his visit at 4 o'clock, and he found Mirah seated at work with only Mrs. Meyrick and Mab, the open piano, and all the glorious company of engravings. The dainty neatness of her hair and dress, the glow of tranquil happiness in a face where a painter need have changed nothing if he had wanted to put it in front of the host singing "Peace on earth and goodwill to men," made a contrast to his first vision of her that was delightful to Deronda's eyes. Mirah herself was thinking of it, and immediately on their greeting said, "See how different I am from the miserable creature by the river. All because you found me and brought me to the very best." "It was my good chance to find you," said Deronda. "Any other man would have been glad to do what I did." "That is not the right way to be thinking about it," said Mirah, shaking her head with decisive gravity. "I think of what really was. It was you, and not another, who found me and were good to me." "I agree with Mirah," said Mrs. Meyrick. "Saint anybody is a bad saint to pray to." "Besides, anybody could not have brought me to you," said Mirah, smiling at Mrs. Meyrick, "and I would rather be with you than with any one else in the world except my mother. I wonder if ever a poor little bird that was lost and could not fly was taken and put into a warm nest where was a mother and sisters who took to it so that everything came naturally, as if it had always been there. I hardly thought before that the world could ever be as happy and without fear as it is to me now." She looked meditative a moment, and then said, "Sometimes I am a little afraid." "What is it you are afraid of?" said Deronda with anxiety. "That when I am turning at the corner of a street I may meet my father. It seems dreadful that I should be afraid of meeting him. That is my only sorrow," said Mirah plaintively. "It is surely not very probable," said Deronda, wishing that it were less so. Then, not to let the opportunity escape, "Would it be a great grief to you now if you were never to meet your mother?" She did not answer immediately, but meditated again, with her eyes fixed on the opposite wall. Then she turned them on Deronda and said firmly, as if she had arrived at the exact truth, "I want her to know that I have always loved her, and if she is alive I want to comfort her. She may be dead. If she were, I should long to know where she was buried, and to know whether my brother lives, so that we can remember her together. But I will try not to grieve. I have thought much for so many years of her being dead, and so I shall have her with me in my mind, as I have always had. We can never be really parted. I think I have never sinned against her. I have always tried not to do what would hurt her. Only she might be sorry that I was not a good Jewess." "In what way are you not a good Jewess?" said Deronda.
I am ignorant, and we never observed the laws, but lived among Christians just as they did. But I have heard my father laugh at the strictness of the Jews about their food and all customs, and their not liking Christians. I think my mother was strict. But she could never want me not to like those who are better to me than any of my own people I have ever known. I think I could obey in other things that she wished, but not in that. It is so much easier to me to share in love than in hatred. I remember a play I read in German. Since I have been here it has come into my mind, where the heroine says something like that." "Antigone," said Deronda. "Ah, you know it. But I do not believe that my mother would wish me not to love my best friends. She would be grateful to them." Here Mirah had turned to Mrs. Meyrick, and with a sudden lighting up of her whole countenance, she said, "Oh, if we ever do meet and know each other as we are now, so that I could tell what would comfort her, I should be so full of blessedness my soul would know no want but to love her." "God bless you, child," said Mrs. Meyrick, the words escaping involuntarily from her motherly heart. But to relieve the strain of feeling she looked at Deronda and said, "It is curious that Mirah, who remembers her mother so well it is as if she saw her, cannot recall her brother the least bit, except the feeling of having been carried by him when she was tired, and of his being near her when she was in her mother's lap. It must be that he was rarely at home. He was already grown up. It is a pity her brother should be quite a stranger to her." "He is good. I feel sure Ezra is good," said Mirah, eagerly. "He loved my mother. He would take care of her. I remember more of him than that. I remember my mother's voice once calling 'Ezra,' and then his answering from a distance, 'Mother.'" Mirah had changed her voice a little in each of these words, and had given them a loving intonation. "And then he came close to us. I feel sure he is good. I have always taken comfort from that." It was impossible to answer this either with agreement or doubt. Mrs. Meyrick and Deronda exchanged a quick glance. About this brother she felt as painfully dubious as he did. But Mirah went on, absorbed in her memories. "Is it not wonderful how I remember the voices better than anything else? I think they must go deeper into us than other things. I have often fancied heaven might be made of voices." "Like your singing, yes," said Mab, who had hitherto kept a modest silence, and now spoke bashfully, as was her wont in the presence of Prince Camaralzaman. "Ma, do ask Mirah to sing. Mr. Deronda has not heard her." "Would it be disagreeable to you to sing now?" said Deronda, with a more deferential gentleness than he had ever been conscious of before. "Oh, I shall like it," said Mirah. "My voice has come back a little with rest." Perhaps her ease of manner was due to something more than the simplicity of her nature. The circumstances of her life made her think of everything she did as work demanded from her in which affection had nothing to do, and she had begun her work before self-consciousness was born. She immediately rose and went to the piano, a somewhat worn instrument that seemed to get the better of its infirmities under the firm touch of her small fingers as she preluded. Deronda placed himself where he could see her while she sang, and she took everything as quietly as if she had been a child going to breakfast. Imagine her. It is always good to imagine a human creature in whom bodily loveliness seems as properly one with the entire being as the bodily loveliness of those wondrous transparent orbs of life that we find in the sea. Imagine her with her dark hair brushed from her temples, but yet showing certain tiny rings there which had cunningly found their own way back, the mass of it hanging behind just to the nape of the little neck in curly fibers, such as renew themselves at their own will after being bathed into straightness like that of water grasses. Then see the perfect cameo her profile makes, cut in a duskish shell, where by some happy fortune there pierced a gem-like darkness for the eye and eyebrow, the delicate nostrils defined enough to be ready for sensitive movements, the finished ear, the firm curves of the chin and neck, entering into the expression of a refinement which was not feebleness. She sang Beethoven's "Per pietà non dirmi addio," with a subdued but searching pathos which had that essential of perfect singing, the making one oblivious of art or manner, and only possessing one with the song. It was the sort of voice that gives the impression of being meant like a bird's wooing for an audience near and beloved. Deronda began by looking at her, but felt himself presently covering his eyes with his hand, wanting to seclude the melody in darkness. Then he refrained from what might seem oddity, and was ready to meet the look of mute appeal which she turned toward him at the end. "I think I have never enjoyed a song more than that," he said gratefully. "You like my singing? I am so glad," she said, with a smile of delight. "It has been a great pain to me because it failed in what it was wanted for. But now we think I can use it to get my bread. I have really been taught well, and now I have 2 pupils that Mrs. Meyrick found for me. They pay me nearly 2 crowns for their 2 lessons." "I think I know some ladies who would find you many pupils after Christmas," said Deronda. "You would not mind singing before any one who wished to hear you?" "Oh, no, I want to do something to get money. I should teach reading and speaking, Mrs. Meyrick thinks. But if no one would learn of me, that is difficult." Mirah smiled with a touch of merriment he had not seen in her before. "I dare say I should find her poor—I mean my mother. I should want to get money for her, and I cannot always live on charity. Though"—here she turned so as to take all 3 of her companions in one glance—"it is the sweetest charity in all the world." "I should think you can get rich," said Deronda, smiling. "Great ladies will perhaps like you to teach their daughters. We shall see. But now do sing again to us." She went on willingly, singing with ready memory various things by Gordigiani and Schubert. Then, when she had left the piano, Mab said entreatingly, "Oh, Mirah, if you would not mind singing the little hymn." "It is too childish," said Mirah. "It is like lisping." "What is the hymn?" said Deronda. "It is the Hebrew hymn she remembers her mother singing over her when she lay in her cot," said Mrs. Meyrick. "I should like very much to hear it," said Deronda, "if you think I am worthy to hear what is so sacred." "I will sing it if you like," said Mirah. "But I don't sing real words, only here and there a syllable like hers. The rest is lisping. Do you know Hebrew? Because if you do, my singing will seem childish nonsense." Deronda shook his head. "It will be quite good Hebrew to me." Mirah crossed her little feet and hands in her easiest attitude, and then lifted up her head in an angle which seemed to be directed to some invisible face bent over her, while she sang a little hymn of quaint melancholy intervals, with syllables that really seemed childish lisping to her audience. The voice in which she gave it forth had gathered even a sweeter, more cooing tenderness than was heard in her other songs. "If I were ever to know the real words, I should still go on in my old way with them," said Mirah, when she had repeated the hymn several times. "Why not?" said Deronda. "The lisped syllables are very full of meaning." "Yes, indeed," said Mrs. Meyrick. "A mother hears something of a lisp in her children's talk to the very last. The words are not just what everybody else says, though they may be spelled the same. If I were to live till my Hans got old, I should still see the boy in him. A mother's love, I often say, is like a tree that has got all the wood in it from the very first it made." "Is not that the way with friendship too?" said Deronda, smiling. "We must not let the mothers be too arrogant." The little woman shook her head over her darning. "It is easier to find an old mother than an old friend. Friendships begin with liking or gratitude, roots that can be pulled up. Mother's love begins deeper down." "Like what you were saying about the influence of voices," said Deronda, looking at Mirah. "I don't think your hymn would have had more expression for me if I had known the words. I went to the synagogue at Frankfort before I came home, and the service impressed me just as much as if I had followed the words—perhaps more." "Oh, was it great to you? Did it go to your heart?" said Mirah, eagerly. "I thought none but our people would feel that. I thought it was all shut away like a river in a deep valley where only heaven saw—I mean—" She hesitated, feeling that she could not disentangle her thought from its imagery. "I understand," said Deronda. "But there is not really such a separation, deeper down, as Mrs. Meyrick says. Our religion is chiefly a Hebrew religion, and since Jews are men, their religious feelings must have much in common with those of other men, just as their poetry, though in one sense peculiar, has a great deal in common with the poetry of other nations. Still it is to be expected that a Jew would feel the forms of his people's religion more than one of another race. And yet—" here Deronda hesitated in his turn. "That is perhaps not always so." "Ah, no," said Mirah, sadly. "I have seen that. I have seen them mock. Is it not like mocking your parents? Like rejoicing in your parents' shame?" "Some minds naturally rebel against whatever they were brought up in, and like the opposite. They see the faults in what is nearest to them," said Deronda, apologetically. "But you are not like that," said Mirah, looking at him with unconscious fixedness. "No, I think not," said Deronda. "But you know I was not brought up as a Jew." "Ah, I am always forgetting," said Mirah, with a look of disappointed recollection, and slightly blushing. Deronda also felt rather embarrassed, and there was an awkward pause, which he put an end to by saying playfully, "Whichever way we take it, we have to tolerate each other; for if we all went in opposition to our teaching, we must end in difference just the same." "To be sure. We should go on forever in zigzags," said Mrs. Meyrick. "I think it is very weak‐minded to make your creed up by the rule of the contrary. Still one may honor one's parents without following their notions exactly, any more than the exact cut of their clothing. My father was a Scotch Calvinist, and my mother was a French Calvinist. I am neither quite Scotch, nor quite French, nor two Calvinists rolled into one, yet I honor my parents' memory." "But I could not make myself not a Jewess," said Mirah, insistently, "even if I changed my belief." "No, my dear. But if Jews and Jewesses went on changing their religion and making no difference between themselves and Christians, there would come a time when there would be no Jews to be seen," said Mrs. Meyrick, taking that consummation very cheerfully. "Oh, please not to say that," said Mirah, the tears gathering. "It is the first unkind thing you ever said. I will not begin that. I will never separate myself from my mother's people. I was forced to fly from my father, but if he came back in age and weakness and want, and needed me, should I say, 'This is not my father'? If he had shame, I must share it. It was he who was given to me for my father, and not another. And so it is with my people. I will always be a Jewess. I will love Christians when they are good like you, but I will always cling to my people. I will always worship with them." As Mirah had gone on speaking, she had become possessed with a sorrowful passion, fervent, not violent. Holding her little hands tightly clasped and looking at Mrs. Meyrick with beseeching, she seemed to Deronda a personification of that spirit which impelled men, after a long inheritance of professed Catholicism, to leave wealth and high place and risk their lives in flight, that they might join their own people and say, "I am a Jew." "Mirah, Mirah, my dear child, you mistake me," said Mrs. Meyrick, alarmed. "God forbid I should want you to do anything against your conscience. I was only saying what might be if the world went on. But I had better have left the world alone and not wanted to be overwise. Forgive me. Come. We will not try to take you from anybody you feel has more right to you." "I would do anything else for you. I owe you my life," said Mirah, not yet quite calm. "Hush, hush now," said Mrs. Meyrick. "I have been punished enough for wagging my tongue foolishly—making an almanac for the millennium, as my husband used to say. But everything in the world must come to an end some time. We must bear to think of that," said Mab, unable to hold her peace on this point. She had already suffered from a bondage of tongue which threatened to become severe if Mirah were to be too much indulged in this inconvenient susceptibility to innocent remarks. Deronda smiled at the irregular blonde face, brought into strange contrast by the sight of Mirah's—smiled, Mab thought, rather sarcastically, as he said, "That prospect of everything coming to an end will not guide us far in practice. Mirah's feelings, she tells us, are concerned with what is." Mab was confused and wished she had not spoken, since Mr. Deronda seemed to think that she had found fault with Mirah. But to have spoken once is a tyrannous reason for speaking again, and she said, "I only meant that we must have courage to hear things, else there is hardly anything we can talk about." Mab felt herself unanswerable here, inclining to the opinion of Socrates, "What motive has a man to live, if not for the pleasure of discourse?" Deronda took his leave soon after, and when Mrs. Meyrick went outside with him to exchange a few words about Mirah, he said, "Hans is to share my chambers when he comes at Christmas." "You have written to Rome about that," said Mrs. Meyrick, her face lighting up. "How very good and thoughtful of you! You mentioned Mirah, then?" "Yes, I referred to her. I concluded he knew everything from you." "I must confess my folly. I have not yet written a word about her. I have always been meaning to do it, and yet have ended my letter without saying a word, and I told the girls to leave it to me. However, thank you 1,000 times." Deronda divined something of what was in the mother's mind, and his divination reinforced a certain anxiety already present in him. His inward colloquy was not soothing. He said to himself that no man could see this exquisite creature without feeling it possible to fall in love with her. But all the fervor of his nature was engaged on the side of precaution. There are personages who feel themselves tragic because they march into a palpable morass, dragging another with them, and then cry out against all the gods. Deronda's mind was strongly set against imitating them. "I have my hands on the reins now," he thought, "and I will not drop them. I shall go there as little as possible." He saw the reasons acting themselves out before him. How could he be Mirah's guardian and claim to unite with Mrs. Meyrick, to whose charge he had committed her, if he showed himself as a lover, whom she did not love, whom she would not marry? And if he encouraged any germ of lover's feeling in himself, it would lead up to that issue. Mirah's was not a nature that would bear dividing against itself, and even if love won her consent to marry a man who was not of her race and religion, she would never be happy in acting against that strong native bias which would still reign in her conscience as remorse. Deronda saw these consequences as we see any danger of marring our own work well begun. It was a delight to have rescued this child acquainted with sorrow, and to think of having placed her little feet in protected paths. The creature we helped to save, though only a half-reared linnet, bruised and lost by the wayside, how we watch and fence it, and dote on its signs of recovery. Our pride becomes loving, our self is a not-self, for whose sake we become virtuous, when we set to some hidden work of reclaiming a life from misery, and look for our triumph in the secret joy. This one is the better for me. "I would as soon hold out my finger to be bitten off as set about spoiling her peace," said Deronda. "It was one of the rarest bits of fortune that I should have had friends like the Meyricks to place her with—generous, delicate friends without any loftiness in their ways, so that her dependence on them is not only safety but happiness. There could be no refuge to replace that if it were broken up. But what is the use of my taking the vows and settling everything as it should be, if that marplot Hans comes and upsets it all?" Few things were more likely. Hans was made for mishaps. His very limbs seemed more breakable than other people's, his eyes more of a resort for uninvited flies and other irritating guests. But it was impossible to forbid Hans coming to London. He was intending to get a studio there and make it his chief home, and to propose that he should defer coming on some ostensible ground, concealing the real motive of winning time for Mirah's position to become more confirmed and independent, was impracticable. Having no other resource, Deronda tried to believe that both he and Mrs. Meyrick were foolishly troubling themselves about one of those endless things called probabilities, which never occur. But he did not quite succeed in his trying. On the contrary, he found himself going inwardly through a scene where on the first discovery of Hans's inclination he gave him a very energetic warning, suddenly checked, however, by the suspicion of personal feeling that his warmth might be creating in Hans. He could come to no result but that the position was peculiar, and that he could make no further provision against dangers until they came nearer. To save an unhappy Jewess from drowning herself would not have seemed a startling variation among police reports, but to discover in her so rare a creature as Mirah was an exceptional event which might well bring exceptional consequences. Deronda would not let himself for a moment dwell on any supposition that the consequences might enter deeply into his own life. The image of Mirah had never yet had that penetrating radiation which would have been given to it by the idea of her loving him. When this sort of effluence is absent from the fancy, whether from the fact or not, a man may go far in devotedness without perturbation. As to the search for Mirah's mother and brother, Deronda took what she had said to-day as a warrant for deferring any immediate measures. His conscience was not quite easy in this desire for delay any more than it was quite easy in his not attempting to learn the truth about his own mother. In both cases he felt that there might be an unfulfilled duty to a parent, but in both cases there was an overpowering repugnance to the possible truth, which threw a turning weight into the scale of argument. "At least I will look about," was his final determination. "I may find some special Jewish machinery. I will wait till after Christmas." What should we all do without the calendar when we want to put off a disagreeable duty? The admirable arrangements of the solar system, by which our time is measured, always supply us with a term before which it is hardly worth while to set about anything we are disinclined to. End of Chapter 32.
This recording is in the public domain.